So just to give some context, I suppose, to what the work I've been doing, I suppose, fits into an ecosystem. And I want to talk a little bit about Ireland and how it's changed over the past 40 years. And indeed, for a small country, like some, I suppose perspective is that Ireland has a population, the Republic of Ireland, which is has a population of 4.5 million people, and including Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, a population of 6 million people. It's still, I suppose, a drop in the world population. So we're talking about 0.1%. But yes, it has had a big impact considering its size. So I was born in 1973. As it happens, coincidentally, the very next day, the mobile phone had its first phone call from Martin Cooper. So Martin Cooper worked in Motorola, and he made the first ever phone call to his rival Joel Engels in Bell Labs. And of course, the call wasn't about me, but this is just some context for my next slide. But actually, in that same year, Ireland joined the European Economic Community, which later became the European Union. And Ireland had been a free state for about 20 years at that stage, but it had adopted quite a protectionist policy in terms of trade with its neighbours. So trying to, I suppose, develop jobs in the company and to trade internally to build up the economy in the country. The growth was substantial in the first few decades of Ireland's existence, but then started to stagnate. And gradually Ireland traded more with its nearest neighbour, the United Kingdom. And then eventually, when they joined the European Union in 1973, we had something approaching real free trade with the other European states. I grew up in Dublin until I was about 10, and I moved to the country. My parents believed we could have a better lifestyle in the country. And when we moved to the country, we had what I thought was interesting. When we were in Dublin, we had a normal rotary dial phone where you could dial your numbers. And when we moved to the country, we had this basically a wind-up phone where you turned the handle inside and you got through to an operator. So this seemed to be a real step back. I was kind of amazed that we were going back to something from the Waltons on television where you had to go through your local switchboard. And indeed, it was because Ireland was actually catching up with the other countries in Europe that we didn't see convergence for another 10 or so years. But then Ireland rapidly expanded for a number of reasons, which we'll look at in a minute in terms of education. But now, of course, it's on par or ahead of other countries in terms of, certainly in terms of technology penetration and other factors. So, just, I suppose, phones, since I was talking about phones, it's an obvious thing to talk about. Mobile penetration in Ireland is at 128%, which is the European average. And over 3/4 of people in Ireland use their mobile devices to access the internet. There's been a huge amount of foreign companies coming to Ireland, which have boosted the ecosystem, ranging across a lot of science and technology sectors. In terms of ICT companies, 10 out of the top 10 tech companies in the world have bases. Some of them, their headquarters in Europe, in Ireland. 17 out of the top 25 medical devices companies have facilities in Ireland. Actually, interesting enough is that half of all med devices companies in Ireland are Irish and half are foreign. And then finally, pharma is huge. Now, mainly foreign companies in the space, but 9 out of the top 10 companies are in Ireland. And half of our exports, 55 billion, come from the pharma companies. So the government body called IDA Ireland, which basically is responsible for industrial development in Ireland from abroad, has been very successful in attracting companies, and I believe 6,000 jobs were created, 6,000 to 7,000 jobs were created by foreign companies in Ireland last year. But of course, the reasons for companies coming are many, and we have a very attractive corporation tax for companies coming from abroad, very strong talent, not only in terms of education but also in terms of creativity and innovation, and also quite high standard of living as rated by the OECD. I was just going to talk a little bit about education. Education is, I suppose, something that we can see has jumped quite substantially in the past 20 years. So originally there were, as I mentioned earlier on, a handful of universities established across the country, and it was only in the 70s that the government started to create regional colleges around the country to try and address the lack of third level education in the country. So in the 1960s, a government minister did a review and proposed the creation of these regional colleges, and it was around the 1970s that they were actually established. But again, a bit like when Ireland joined the European Union, it took a few years for the impact of that to be realised. So I think this table here kind of illustrates that, and this is just comparing third level qualifications, people who had received degrees and PhDs in Ireland to some other countries. So in 1991, the number of people with a third level qualification in Ireland was just 14%. But 20 years later, it was 31%. So it had more than doubled during that time. You can see also the number of people 15 and over who had a degree, 26%, and then PhDs. That had actually increased by about 50% from about 5 years earlier. And you could compare the figures in Ireland to, I suppose, its neighbouring countries, but also to international standards, and see that they are similar to those numbers. In the ICT space, 2/3 of the people who are working in ICT in Ireland have a third level qualification, but there's still a lot of jobs unfilled in the country, and the education sector has been trying to catch up in terms of producing graduates for the ICT sector. So, for example, in computer science, there was an increase over the past 4 years of 40% in terms of computer graduates, but there's still some work to do in terms of getting the skilled people that the Indigenous and the multinational companies in the space in Ireland require. And we regularly hear of companies crying out for computer engineers or electronics people, and having to look abroad to try and fill those places. Of course, the issue there is that bringing somebody in from abroad requires a special visa, and it takes time. It can take months to try and acquire that visa, by which time maybe that job has changed. There's also been a lot of talk about consolidation and the number of universities in Ireland, and there's a lot of I suppose uninformed commentary that the number of universities in Ireland is quite big considering the size of the country. But yet, if you look at the figures, this is from research carried out by Ferdinand von Prozinski a few years ago, and I've just updated the figures here for this presentation. But in actuality, the number of universities in Ireland is quite small compared to the number of people. So if you look at the ratio there in the bottom right, 1 to every 655,000 people is quite high in terms of the number of people to universities, compared to other countries, which you can see there as well. Even if we include those regional colleges, or as they are called, institutes of technology now, the number is still higher than some other countries. So consolidation is okay as long as you can maintain the number of opportunities for students to go to university, and indeed maybe a stronger university will make it easier to have a higher number of students. But it's just something to be careful of, that we want to make sure we have the correct ratio of opportunities for students to go to third level. In parallel with providing undergraduate education, the Irish government was very proactive in terms of developing higher degrees, for postgraduate degrees and PhDs and masters and so on. And also as part of this, they decided to try and establish various centres of excellence in research around the country. So one of the government bodies is something called Science Foundation Ireland. And Science Foundation Ireland was modelled roughly on the NSF in the United States. And the idea was to establish centres of research and excellence in bio and in ICT around the country. And they did this quite effectively by taking proposals and establishing these centres in various, usually associated with various universities or with groups of universities. If I give an example of Derry, which is the institute I'm affiliated with, in 2003, 10 years ago, in terms of semantic web research in Galway, there were 0 people there. And 10 years later, there's 140 people there. Not just 140 people researching this area, but actually the top research institute in semantic web in the world in terms of publications and research in its core space. So the effect of this is that if you get the right people in, if you have the right structure to support it, you can actually have a very successful outcome. And of course, as well as carrying out basic research, the objective of these centres is to interact with companies, be they multinationals or indigenous companies, or maybe helping with the creation of startups. That there's basically a whole ecosystem of activity around these research institutes. Of course, they're a great source of professor entrepreneurs and postdoctoral entrepreneurs, or even student entrepreneurs, and some nice examples there which you can find out some more about from the various institutes. Now, education is kind of one part of the picture, and I've drawn this little puzzle to kind of show that there are initiatives that can be done outside of the education sphere. And, you know, like a lot of the world, Ireland has experienced recession in the past 5 or 6 years. And parallel with that, it's been nice to see that various people have established a lot of non-profit initiatives to try and help things along, to try and help grow activities at all levels, ranging from schools right through to big corporations. So if I look at some of these, Coderdojo I think is fascinating. It's basically a set of coding clubs for young people that are run at weekends in a non-profit capacity. And the idea there being to enable people in schools to develop programming skills that they can bring through to companies, either through a route through university or otherwise. Even though just established less than 2 years ago, there are 134 Coderdojo's in 22 countries, including one here in Silicon Valley. Hackerspaces is again a great way for people to learn about technology. The aim there to being able to build and make things. Creative spaces is another term that's used. A whole bunch of these have been established around Ireland in the past 2 years, including one near me in Galway called 091 Labs. We have things like the Irish Technology Leadership Group, which is a networking community for Irish tech leaders in Ireland, the US and elsewhere. They run a series of events to try and bring companies together and to bring innovative research and industry together through the network. Ireland has a big diaspora that can leverage, and there's a variety of activities there, from commercial sites networking people to initiatives to try and bring people to Ireland, like the Gathering, to the Global Irish Economic Forum, which aimed to try and leverage the Irish expat community to help with some of Ireland's economic problems. We have Connect Ireland, which is a nice initiative from the Irish government, where they're basically offering effectively rewards to people who bring in foreign companies into Ireland, who will then create jobs. Open Ireland, which is another great initiative from Sean O'Sullivan, is aiming to increase the skilled population in Ireland by making it easier to get a work visa from graduates of the top 250 universities, and also to make Ireland more of a gateway to China in Europe. We have the Web Summit, which is the biggest tech conference in Europe, which is held in Dublin every year, and then other initiatives like the Irish Executives Network and NGen Ireland, which is trying to promote the under 33s, who are in many respects the future of the country. In parallel, then, we've had a range of incubators being established around the country. Now, I suppose universities are a typical place where incubators are set up, but there's also been a lot of third-party initiatives to create incubators around the country. And we've had multinational incubator groups like Dogpatch and Startup Bootcamp coming to set up their own incubators in different places. In fact, Dogpatch recently announced that they would be expanding their operations in Dublin and reducing some of the operations elsewhere, because they see Dublin as being a place of opportunity. And we have Weira, which is the incubator of Telefonica, was established recently in Dublin as well. But in parallel with this, we have a range of investors have linked in as well. And one of the Irish government bodies which helps with investment is something called Enterprise Ireland. Enterprise Ireland basically provide investment for Indigenous Irish companies who are in need of support. But they've also joined up with a number of seed capital and venture funds, and I've underlined them here in green on the right hand side. But you can see basically a range of international and also national funds that have been set up both in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland as well. So I've given you kind of some of the context around what's going on in Ireland, and from my perspective as an academic who is also involved in startups and hopefully encouraging startups to be founded by students and other people, we have some nice initiatives in our university. One of these is called Explorer. Explorer is being run by the Students' Union in NUI Galway and the university. And basically they fund staff-student collaborations to the tune of €1,000, which is about $1,300. And you propose some idea, and if it's innovative enough, hopefully you'll receive funding. One of the ones that I think is quite interesting is Exponential. So Exponential was proposed by one of our students to try and connect students and entrepreneurs. He saw something like this in the Valley when he was an intern here, and then he decided to try and replicate it in Galway. And basically the event is held in a casual setting where the entrepreneur tells some of their story and where they came from and how their company was developed. And then because it's in a casual setting like a bar or an Irish pub, the students can interact with the entrepreneur afterwards and ask questions. And this is hugely important. I mentioned when I was a postgraduate student, I formed boards.ie with some gaming friends. But without those co-founders, it never would have happened, because I wouldn't have known how to set up a company or to know how to do the legal stuff or the accounting stuff. And they fortunately had their own company, and they knew all of that. So it actually sounds simple, but it's actually a step that students often can't take because they just are unaware of the process. So having an event where students can interact with an entrepreneur and kind of get over that hurdle is hugely important. We have events like Coderdojo, which is basically an app development competition where students in teams can create apps for the web or for mobiles. And this is run in conjunction very closely with local companies who are startups in the app space, and indeed later on will hopefully employ some of these students when they graduate. Interactions are hugely important with companies, but also with the wider community, whether it's giving talks about research or your areas of interest, or just interacting with various community groups. As mentioned earlier on, Hackerspace movement is very important in terms of raising people's interest in creating systems and making things and learning skills. And more broadly, I'm interested in identifying the innovators in the Irish tech scene, whether they are in Ireland or abroad, because oftentimes we don't always do the best job of promoting what's going on. And an article which describes some of the Irish tech innovators can be very important for just building an awareness of what's going on. So we have various initiatives, and we have obviously industry growing in Ireland, and you've seen a little bit about the institutions that have been established, but there are individuals as well, and it's also good to promote what's going on there, but also to put in a global context, to kind of make it part of the overall story. So there might be an Irish story one day, and there might be some story of global coming from somewhere else in the globe the next day to, I suppose, just interleave and show how they're all connected. So with that, I'd like to say thanks for watching the video, and I look forward to your comments.